Bonjour. Thank you. As you will know, on Monday, the 18th Conference of the Parties under the Framework Convention on Climate Change began its negotiations in Doha, Qatar. I had planned on being there. I have attended climate negotiations for many years. I'm very disappointed that I've had to cancel going to Doha, not because I ever look forward to these things. It's sort of like looking forward to going to the dentist. But I'm the only opposition member of parliament who had planned to go. The decision of Stephen Harper to exclude opposition MPs from the delegation means that apparently other opposition parties have decided that the climate negotiations aren't a priority for them. And last year I paid my own way to Durban. I was prepared to do so again to go to Doha. But the changed scheduling around the C-45 second omnibus budget bill votes, which will now take place all next week, require that I stay here. I obviously regard the C-45 omnibus budget bill changes on immigration, on the Naval Waters Protection Act, and other areas are significant and require every good faith effort to achieve compromise with the government. So I am putting forward 80 amendments, and I will be hearing from the Speaker soon how many of those will be going forward to a vote. So due to that, I'm canceling going to Doha myself, but I'm staying in very close touch. And I would have, all things being equal, I think it's important to be there to keep an eye on what Canada is doing. But I'm relying on civil society from Canada, particularly the youth delegation. And given that I've now canceled my trip, I'll be sending funding to help the Canadian youth delegation in Doha with the work that they're doing. They're doing tremendous work. We should be very proud of our youth, even when we can't be proud of the Prime Minister. So I'm calling on the Prime Minister to change direction. Il n'est pas trop tard pour un autre approche vers les négociations à Doha. C'est possible pour M. Kent quand il serait là, commencement de semaine, je pense, la prochaine semaine, c'est au niveau haut pour les négociations où tous les ministres autour du monde vont participer dans les négociations absolument d'urgence. C'est possible pour le Canada de changer la décision de l'année passée de quitter le protocole de Kyoto. Right now, our decision to leave the Kyoto Protocol was manifested in a one-year written notice. This one-year written notice of intent to quit a legally binding global treaty will take effect December 15th. By the way, to underscore the point, this is the first time in the history of Canada that any government has legally withdrawn from a treaty we have ratified. In any case, we are still legally Kyoto parties until the end of the Doha negotiations. Doha negotiations conclude December 7th or 8th, depending on how long they go into overtime. And Canada is still legally a Kyoto party. So on the first day of the negotiations in Doha, and I think it's important to set the context, because I think Canadians, and particularly perhaps journalists, have become so used to the idea that Canada performs poorly in these international negotiations that we're not paying sufficient attention to what our government is doing to bring us further into global disrepute. So what I propose to do in a few moments this morning is sketch out what's going on in Doha in terms of global negotiations and the scientific community's warnings that the situation relating to the climate crisis is worsening faster than even the negative models that had people saying that the IPCC was wrong on the science. Even the IPCC's projections were far too optimistic based on what we're seeing in real life right now in empirically measurable changes in climate. So back to Doha. What's happened on the first day? Well, the Fossil of the Day award, Canada placed first place finish on the Fossil of the Day. Now, everybody hears about Fossils of the Day. Last year, at the climate negotiations in Durban, when environment critic Megan Leslie of the NDP announced that we had won the first Fossil of the Day award, as if on cue, and I suspect it was on cue, all the Conservative members started to laugh in a fake laugh way. So obviously they're trying to minimize Fossils of the Day. Fossil of the Day award is not because people don't like Canada's oil sands, don't like our economy, don't like our culture, our society. A Fossil of the Day award is a specific recognition by civil society from around the world towards the country that has done the most in that one day in negotiations to obstruct progress. It's a very specific reflection of what we're doing on the ground in negotiations. So yesterday's fossil of the day to Canada is because of comments that Peter Kent made back here in Canada saying that we had no intention of providing funding at this conference. He apparently said that he would, quote, make it clear at the meetings in Doha that developing countries shouldn't expect more money towards climate financing from Canada. And he said, quote, Doha isn't a pledging conference. Well, what was? And I go back to the Copenhagen Accord that the Harper cabinet says it loves so very much. When Canada was in Copenhagen back in 2009, we did sign this document in which, and just to give a little bit more background, the Copenhagen Accord was, in my view, a bogus backroom deal. It was not a product of the UN negotiations, and it wasn't something that had large buy-in, particularly from the developing world. But in any case, in Copenhagen, Stephen Harper, who was personally there, signed a commitment that they would start, globally, the industrialized countries would ramp up to $30 billion a year in support for developing nations, for adaptation, for capacity building, between 2010 and 2012, $30 billion US a year, ramping up to $100 billion a year by 2020. In Copenhagen, Canada pledged $1.2 billion over 3 years for what was referred to as the fast start of this financing model. And at this point, $200 million of that remains to be allocated. So what we have done by saying this isn't a pledging conference, Canada doesn't plan to provide additional funding to developing countries, Canadians need to understand that this is in the context of a country that has first repudiated its obligations under a legally binding treaty, Kyoto, then pretended we were going to stay in Kyoto during the Durban conference, only to announce we were legally departing Kyoto as soon as Peter Kent returned to Canada. This announcement, the Fossil of the Day Award in Doha for Canada, is because we are now bailing on commitments from the non-legally binding but much touted Copenhagen Accord. Right? So we've also, of course, taken pledges to reduce emissions under the Copenhagen Accord targets, which are not legally binding. Canada left Copenhagen and actually weakened our target for emissions reductions. First, of course, Stephen Harper weakened our targets for emissions reductions by repudiating the Kyoto target of 6% below 1990 levels by between 2008 and 2012. He weakened it and said, okay, by under 2006 levels, we'll go 20% below 2006, and we'll do that by 2020. Sounded plausible, but it was a weaker target. We returned from Copenhagen and weakened the target again, because we said, we're going to be in lockstep with the U.S. administration. So we'll go, instead of going 20% below 2006 levels by 2020, we'll go 17% below 2005 levels, which is what Barack Obama had pledged, by 2020. Difference for Canada, a little bit of an anomaly. In 2006, our emissions were actually lower than they were the year before in 2005. Just a little anomaly. And 17% below 2005 actually leaves Canada above 1990 levels by 2020, the only industrialized country with a commitment and a target that weak. So the other countries around the world are also saying to Canada, you've pledged in the Copenhagen Accord and subsequent UN documents and negotiations in Cancun and in Durban to ensure that globally we don't go above 2 degrees Celsius global average warming above industrialized. Before the Industrial Revolution, that's the benchmark for how much has our temperature risen. So to go 2 degrees above the levels of temperature in global average terms, not national terms or regional terms, global average temperature measured between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and at some point in the future. So we're now about 0.8 degrees above Industrial Revolution levels. We're seeing changes that are profound. Canada has pledged, as have all other industrialized countries, to keep emission levels below 2 degrees global average warming. Why? Is it a random target? No, it's a best guess of scientists to give us some hope of survival. So when we start talking about 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and 5 degrees Celsius, which is what the International Energy Agency is now warning us, we're on track, given current levels of emissions and the weak commitments thus far made by industrialized countries, we're on track to blow past 2 degrees and go to 3 degrees or 4 degrees. I'll come back to why that matters. So in these global negotiations, Canada has, at this point, probably pretty much the worst reputation in the room, and we're about to make it worse. It was confirmed in our all-party climate caucus meetings, which we held for to get a pre-Doha briefing, that, going back to my earlier point, Canada is still technically a Kyoto party until December 15th. So our delegation actually plans to participate in the negotiations. We actually plan to weaken the second commitment period under Kyoto while we're still legally a party before leaving. I can't imagine anything more designed to bring Canada into global disrepute. Again, this is from the newsletter of the global environmental groups gathered in Doha, and it's their newsletter is headed on its first day, Dear Canada, and they say, "We know you are still technically allowed in the Kyoto room, but please don't touch that microphone. When you jumped ship on the first Kyoto Protocol term as it hit the home stretch, you drowned what little credibility you had left. As a matter of principle, you, Canada, should sit silently in the back like the bad kid in the class who has been told to be quiet until they learn how to behave." Well, I know from the chief negotiator for Canada that we're not going to sit back quietly. We plan to actively grab that microphone and weaken commitments being taken by other countries for the second commitment period under Kyoto. So I don't know how Canada could do anything more designed to bring us into a situation where we are a global pariah, not just under Kyoto, but in any other rooms where countries from around the world run into Canada. We're increasingly seen as a rogue state that pays no attention to its legally binding commitments and shows such disrespect for the process that even once we've announced that we are legally withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, we will be in the room in Doha to weaken the agreements. Lastly, I said I'd touch on the science. You can look anywhere. Because of the global climate negotiations beginning now, a lot of scientific reports were timed to come out as negotiators gather in Doha. Anywhere you look, and I don't have time to cite them all, but sea levels are rising 60% faster than projected, is one report coming out of the Potsdam Institute. Arctic ice is melting much faster than projected. Permafrost is melting faster than projected. Canadian glaciers around the world are disappearing faster than projected. The jet stream has altered its course, something that we hadn't anticipated, leading to extreme weather events, including the kind of superstorm Sandy. We are seeing loss of life, increased extreme weather events right across the board. Climate change is a climate crisis, not in the future, but now, and that's with only 0.8 degrees warming above pre-industrial revolution levels. We are on course right now to 4 degrees warming, which could well put us past what some scientists refer to it as a point of no return, in which we enter a period of self-accelerating, unstoppable global warming, which could, I don't know how human civilization would survive it. I like to think we'd survive as a species, but we'd be small remnant groups of humans trying to eke it out on a ruined planet. These are not jokes. These are not political targets. This is not something that other parties should decide they just give it a miss because climate isn't top of mind right now. Any honest person in political life who's looked at this science should be screaming from the rooftops that our kids' lives are at stake right now, and Canada should, with the time remaining, rip up that letter that says we're leaving Kyoto. If the negotiations are so important, we're going to be in the room this week in Doha, then we ought to say we're staying in the room. We're going to take our targets that are now politically binding. If Stephen Harper thinks we can meet 17% below 2005 by 2020, which, as I've said, is a very weak target, okay, tell the rest of the world we'll negotiate to get back into Kyoto, but that's our target. You know what? They'd take us back, because the global effort to have legally binding targets right now lives in one place, the second phase of Kyoto. The next agreement that they're working on simultaneously would not come into effect till 2020, which is too late for our kids.